Do you have a presentation you want to share with us?
Yeah, we have a PDF of a PowerPoint that I kind of forget how to drive in this committee. If we get plugged in or.
You join the Zoom.
Okay, join the Zoom. Great.
Your email is. So it's still Friday, January 12th, and we are going to get a progress report regarding lots of efforts from the Department of Taxes thinking about our appraisal system. This is all in response to H480, which I'm sure has an act number that I don't have off the top of my head, but I'm sure we'll get to in a minute. And I'm really grateful to the two of you for coming in to talk to us about this.
Thank you. Thanks for having us. I'm Jill Remick. I'm the Director of Property Valuation and Review at the Tax Department. And we do have a PowerPoint, and also the report itself is on the legislative reports page, I believe. And I think there's a link to it from our PDF. So yeah, H480 is now Act 68 of 2023. And I'm always going to say of 2023 because Act 60 and Act 68 are such a foundational piece of our education property tax structure.
And maybe someday this will be too.
Right. So just for a little bit of context, we spent a good deal of time in this committee and others on both sides of the chamber discussing this bill and the state of reappraisals in Vermont generally, and then there's lots of pieces within that. So when the bill passed, we were asked to provide a December 2023 progress report on just how things had gone so far. In the bill, there were some specific asks for this progress report that we're about to walk you folks through. And then there is a larger recommendation and legislative proposal that's due December of 2024. So 11 months from now, if that makes sense.
Sorry.
I like being warm, but it is warm here.
Yeah,
I mean, I'm usually very happy to be warm.
yeah, I'm wearing a summer suit, but I was very cold in the rest of the building.
So the primary topic of the conversations was the state of reappraisals in Vermont. There were a lot of concerns about the impact of the COVID real estate market on common level of appraisals, or CLAs. There are a lack of firms that conduct reappraisals in Vermont, and there's also a lot of challenges that municipalities have right now to find both listers and assessors to conduct the annual grand list maintenance and to find firms that are interested in doing this work. So for a little bit more context, just to sort of get our brains back in this before we dig into the process, some states have regular reappraisal cycles, some have a statewide system, some do it by county, a lot of them do it by county or district. In Vermont, the reappraisal mandate is basically when a town's, prior to the bill, CLA or COD reaches a certain threshold, then they get a reappraisal order from the tax department.
Can you remind us what the COD is?
Yeah, so that is the coefficient of dispersion. So that is the valuation of things within a certain category within that town, and the comparison of the categories within the town so that you're not, it's another equity measure basically within the valuation of the town. So in Vermont, we had kind of already had this backlog, right? So reappraisals were not happening very often. It was really hard for towns to find firms to conduct this work. So we had quite the backlog. And then we went into the COVID real estate market where properties were changing values really quickly. And it just created this good momentum to have this conversation. And so we came to this committee. There was a lot of testimony from a lot of different stakeholders, because as you can imagine, this is, if this was easy, it would be done already, but basically there's pretty much universal agreement that we need to do something differently about the structure of reappraisals in Vermont. Some of the other major pieces that came out of those conversations were things like a more regular reappraisal cycle. That's pretty universally accepted. How many years that is, can vary depending on individuals, but the national standard is 4 to 6 years. So the language that passed is based on a 6-year reappraisal cycle. There were also components of the bill that asked us to report back on different types of property and different uses of property. There also is a component in the legislation about implicit bias reduction for listing and assessing practices. So you folks might remember, you heard from Susanna Davis from the Office of Racial Equity. Property valuation, property assessment, whether it's for taxation purposes or lending purposes, there are some implicit bias data pieces that we were asked to look at and then to impact our lister education training, because one of the other big components of our department is training listers and assessors. Then there were other components like, is the April 1 versus January 1 grand list lodging date still a reasonable date? Do we want to consider a different time frame for those pieces? And we do have some items in the progress report that will get into that a little bit further. So on slide, oh, sorry.
Yeah,
I know, I feel like I'm talking fast and I'm gonna make sure you're catching up. So some of the immediate pieces that came out of this in the spring were that the reappraisal orders that come from the tax department are now only based on the coefficient of dispersion. Now, this being said, there were plenty of years worth of CLA-based reappraisal orders. This did not negate them, and I want to make that really clear. There are a lot of towns that already have a reappraisal either underway, they have a contract. They're currently scheduling. We spent a good chunk of time with our team going through this yesterday. Towns are scheduling out to 2028 already. There's just not enough firms to do this work and not enough time to do it. We also were asked immediately to incorporate that implicit bias reduction training into our program. So that has, we've conducted reviews of our materials and done some training internally and done some national research and worked with the Office of Racial Equity. So I'll include some information on that. One of the other immediate pieces that came out of the legislation was, and thank you very much, was a $50,000 appropriation for us to actually contract with a professional outside entity to help us really do the national and state research that would do this Ask Justice, so that when we come back to you all in December of next year, then we will have this significant amount of work done by a professional assessment contractor. And so that was another piece that came about right away. And we'll have a little bit more information on that as well. One of the big pieces that was included in our report back to you folks is a proposed schedule, right? We have to start somewhere as far as like, what does that look like? What are the factors we use to analyze that? And then in December 2024, which we're now in, which is crazy, there is a pretty detailed report back to the legislature on an approved reappraisal system for Vermont. So lots to do. And then there were some other components in Act 68 that were additional pieces that were related, right? There's lots of current statutory language and practice and administrative rules regarding appraisal in Vermont that has not been touched for quite a while. And so this included some pieces about ensuring that municipalities hire assessors that are approved by PBR. That language was somewhat in the statute, but this made it more clear. Also that the select board needs to notify us within 2 weeks if they have voted to replace the listers. So current language, and this is happening in a few towns each year, is the town can vote to eliminate the board of listers and then hire a municipal assessor or appoint someone. And if they are unable to find enough folks to make up a quorum of their listers, they can do the same until they can hold their special meeting or appoint someone else. And towns can also hold that as a special meeting, not just wait for their town meeting day. One of the pieces I think you folks might have heard from some of the listing community about, one of the components that's really important to improving our reappraisal system and our regular grand list maintenance is education and training. And so starting in January 1, 2026, elected listers must meet qualifications and training provided by PBR. A lot of those folks do that voluntarily already. It's offered free of charge. And through COVID, it did sort of force us in a good way to utilize a lot more online. So we're able to do webinars, record them, have them available to folks at any time. And then if somebody is elected to be a lister and does not have those requirements right off the bat, which is probably going to happen a fair amount, they have a year to come into compliance with that. All right, so that's kind of where we started from in the spring. And now we'll get into the pieces of the report we have for you folks.
Great. Kayla, give it back. Sorry, Laura, come over here. Great. So I've dropped links to our progress report. Oh, sorry, Rebecca Samroth, Deputy Commissioner of the Tax Department, for the record. There's links all over this. If you guys have it open for, if you want to link into the progress report for more information at any point in going over this material. But just so high level, we thought we'd walk through the parts of this that were highlighted in the progress report, parts of all this work. As Jill mentioned, a big piece of this was presenting a preliminary reappraisal schedule for a 6-year cycle. We'll have a slide on that coming up. We also reported back on the status of our work on municipal data collection, which so far has been compiling the CAMA data fields from the vendors that work in Vermont municipalities, learning about overlaps there and, starting to consider, opportunities for how that data can be like made more uniform and aggregated at the state level. The other aspects of data collection that we're excited about looking into for 2024 include like much more learning about, what's kind of like hot and modern in terms of valuation and reappraisal tools, like more modern data collection tools, which I was a little bit more familiar with than I am, but it's all very exciting to start learning about and something we're really looking forward to this year. There's also a progress report focus on the current and then ongoing implicit bias reduction training for listers and assessors, and also for department staff internally that I'll get a little bit more into on a coming slide. And then there was also a specific call out in our progress report, or in this statute assigning us the progress report, to report back on the one of the smaller components of this whole exercise, which was exploring changing the grand list as of date from April 1st to maybe January 1st or another date. So we report back on some of the initial findings there, which is an area that we're going to keep learning about and developing. So far, we have like a pretty thorough list of statutory references that also rely on that date. So kind of like tracking down the impacts throughout the rest of the tax code. And we did some stakeholder engagement around that piece too, with some pretty mixed results. So kind of like following the threads from that, those discussions is still on the list of areas to explore for 2024. I'm not sure if I can actually. Yeah, but we have it nicely summarized in the report, but I feel like I would need to reseat myself in those stakeholder engagement surveys. There's like a lot of perspectives on this move. It just seems like a lot of factors. We can come back and chat about that one specifically for sure. Happy to come back. We'll also just talk about broadly the 2024 work plan, which we summarize in the progress report as well. So moving right along, very excited to have a pretty map for this committee. There's a lot more detail on what this pretty map is all about in the report itself.
I just want to say, while we're talking about pretty maps, that zip code map from last year, I've referenced at least every 2 weeks ever since.
Wow.
That's why I just want you to know that it actually it has had broad use.
Warms my heart.
Yes.
If you need copies of that at any point for your personal use.
It definitely will not be for my personal use.
Yeah. As you'll read about in the progress report, if you're so interested, the PBR staff members did a lot of work in the 6 months since this report assignment in setting up a preliminary reappraisal schedule. It was an awesome exercise, like really great foresight to have that highlighted in our, I think, in our status update report this year, because like making sure this exercise was ready for this session really pointed in a lot of directions of further, research and learning and engagement. Basically the team put together a reappraisal schedule that's based on geographic assessment areas. I think that's a term of art that we came up with, GAAs. There's 53 of them throughout the state, as indicated here. They're based primarily on geography, but then also considered to the extent possible grand list age, and also what reappraisal work is scheduled currently. It's a lot of factors to try and include at once. So geography is kind of the main one there. In develop, what?
Does that mean like we're like trying to match sort of similar communities from a property valuation perspective, sort of like housing markets, or
There was consideration of those, but of factors like that. But there's there's a longer list of pros and cons kind of to this approach in the progress report itself, and some of the cons that were listed were like some of the things that we had to overlook in order to prioritize any kind of like grouping rationale, and some of that was out of order here. Included think like in a dream world, I think we would consider have been able to fully consider which contractors municipalities already have relationships with and what kind of camera systems they use, and what the some factors it talked about the software they're using, things like that. But much of that had to be ignored to prioritize on geography and oldest grand list here. So it's kind of like a triage of factors there. I don't know if you have any more.
Yeah, and on our
Absolutely,
website
on
right
that.
now, you can actually, it's kind of neat, there's a map you can select by year, what reappraisals have happened in those particular years. So you can look at 2020 or 2023, and there's a map that will light up the ones that are underway. So you do see, in some cases, there are sort of clusters there. There are so many ways to slice this. We had two of the smartest people in the state of Vermont, I would say, not
Not either of us.
Not
Neither of us.
try to work through this 3D puzzle, right? There's regional planning commission boundaries, there's school district supervisory union boundaries, there's a lot of ways to slice it. So we combine sort of these really smart data analyses by our data folks with our district advisors who know more about the markets and things like that. So you might see that there's some SU overlap, but it's generally, as Rebecca said, those sort of three main indicators. And it often doesn't necessarily follow school district boundaries or even county boundaries. So there are a million different ways you could slice this, but this was after a lot of analysis, okay, this is where we can start. And it does feel, there's an appendices in the report that actually lists each town, their last reappraisal and so on, which group they fall in. And it's also based on parcel count to make sure that kind of the same number of parcels are going to be assessed every year, which is also a struggle. So, yeah. Sorry.
You just, in the last sentence, you said sort of the same number of parcels in each cluster. I was thinking of the workload comparability, again, anticipating how attractive some clusters would be to a contractor or not, and thinking that's to get to the end of this process, a sort of prime objective is, can we find the people who say, I'll do this, this, and this? And that's a workload issue, really.
Exactly.
Yeah, okay.
Right, some of the larger reappraisal companies indicated hesitancy to bid on projects that were smaller than 5,000 parcels, and these ones, the median group size is just over 6,000 parcels per GAA.
What happens when you have that overlap where you're assessing properties in two different school districts, but not the complete school district of one of them? Or does that happen?
Well, I would just offer that already happens because you have multiple towns in the school district, and towns are on wildly different appraisal schedules from each other.
So what does happen?
I'll have to answer that.
Well, so they have their individual town CLAs
Different.
applied to their tax rates.
Yeah.
So, even Montpelier, Roxbury, right? Montpelier has a separate tax rate and a separate CLA from Roxbury. We're in the same district. That happens now, and we reappraised on different years.
But would the assessed value be updated when a town does an assessment, when it overlaps? The overlapping one, is the grand list updated to reflect that assessed value?
For the particular town.
Yeah.
It's totally by town.
Oh, okay. So the updating the grand list is totally by town.
Yes.
The assessment, that
Yep.
makes sense. Okay.
So as part of developing this preliminary reappraisal schedule, we also had, the team had a lot of opportunity to think about transition planning and developing a transition plan for, just what it's like to get from there to here. Always, the stickiest issues happen in those transitions. And they were very, I think, pleased in the progress made there. The progress report outlines more details here, but the team planned a transition from current current status to a 6-year cycle that would rely on deferments for some towns in just the first round of their group's reappraisal, where if your town had reappraised recently and the most recent equalization statistics determined that your equalization statistics were still reasonable, you could have a buy from that first group round of your GAA. And then, by the second round, everyone would be on getting reappraised together at the same time. But there's more details about that in the progress report as well. And that will have the outcome of, kind of getting to those, like full groupings of towns by the second cycle, and allowing some flexibility for folks in the first cycle to make sure that we're not discouraging reappraisal contracting and activity in the meantime while this all rolls out and gets finalized. The other, big takeaway from this exercise was, not surprisingly, just the need to continue considering accompanying reforms to just grouping towns. There's, a lot of efficiency to be gained by grouping this way, but it certainly doesn't, get us all the way to where we want to be. So continuing to explore the statutory requirements around what a reappraisal entails in terms of the type of data that's being collected or the way it's being collected, that all remains important. Considering grand list deadlines, especially around the appeals process and considering the appeals process in general, there's other areas where economies of scale and efficiency could be found to, tie into a grouping towns together like this. And that's all great because that's exactly what we're tasked with exploring this year.
Can I add more
Yeah,
things?
please.
So, and if it's helpful to just think about what problems we were trying to solve here that going on a regular cycle and divvying up that workload would solve, right? So a lot of the towns that have very low parcel counts, they'll send out RFPs all over and won't hear back. This would create opportunities for vendors who are interested in coming to Vermont, but right now it's very sort of hit or miss. It's not worth their time, even our neighboring states, to come to a 500 parcel town. That's not financially worth it. So this creates hopefully a desirability for the firms to create, to contract with multiple towns in an area, which makes sense. They're often also sharing a market. It theoretically could cut back on the volatility of the CLA and COD because we're doing it on a regular cycle. And it also creates I think those are the two big pieces I want to make sure I mentioned. That by having these groupings and having it on a regular cycle, there are multiple pros to moving to this regular 6-year cycle and having it be really clear. I think what we've heard from a lot of other states as well is when you have a regular cycle like this, you lose that volatility of the CLA and COD, right? We're reappraising every 6 years. Towns will fall into this pattern. The vendors can fall into the pattern. A lot of municipalities use the same firm that does their reappraisal for their CAMA system or to carry out their work between reappraisals. So this creates that sort of stability for that as well. So there's a lot of, right now we don't have this and we've got a few problems we're trying to solve, but I think it's a really great direction that this pointed us to try to start somewhere.
Representative Anthony?
I was just looking at the full text, and I was trying to locate the discussion, fleshing out the paragraph that you've entitled accompanying reforms, and I don't see a fleshing out in the report itself. I see the topics, but am I right? There isn't anything embedded in the progress report that discusses. And I'm particularly interested in the appeals process as it happens.
Yeah.
That's what we are coming back
Okay.
in December 2024. And part of, and Rebecca will get to in a minute, that some of the RFP that we put out for this contractor to help us with is a look at the appeals process, other ways and some.
I have to say, words like centralizing and standardizing have pros and cons, put it that way, having seen it work out in, say, the Act 50 context.
Well, and this might be wishful thinking, but long-term, again, this will take several years, whatever direction ends up happening.
Yeah.
But the nationally, in addition to all the other good reasons why you'd want your grand list to be updated regularly, there's fewer appeals because right now we've got grand list, you're getting your revaluation for the first time in 10, 15 years. It's shocking. If you have a regular cycle and you kind of know that and you're used to that, it actually hopefully can reduce some of those appeals as well.
I think it would also reduce some of the CLA feelings that people are having, all of these things.
Yeah, thank you. Awesome. So moving along. All right, so another area of report back in this progress report was the topic of implicit bias reduction training for listers and assessors, and I'll also add for our internal staff in PBR and then the throughout the department actually. There's more content on this in the report, but just high level to date, we and PBR have had meetings with the Vermont Office of Racial Equity to plan both immediate implicit bias reduction training for PBR staff, which just commenced yesterday. Very exciting, since the release of our report. And also just continue work on the broader education strategy that would include municipal officials. We have the internal training is has a lot of components. Jill was there yesterday. I would love more flavor from that. But one of the goals here was kind of like the, teach a man to fish approach to having us review our own documents, resources, trainings to make sure that we're able to identify places where some of our own materials may be ignoring implicit bias or ignoring opportunities to reduce implicit bias. So I'm really excited about the outcome of that focus of the internal training. And we have a Q1 goal this year of reissuing updated content with a special focus on the Lister handbook, but then also looking at our other training and guidance materials internally.
Do you all have the resources, and does the Office of Racial Equity have the resources to be doing
Such a very specific area of bias.
They've provided us with some really good national information
Great.
for sure. And the training, they did tailor their training yesterday to us to some extent. But we would also rely on the Appraisal Institute or in IAAO, the International Association of Assessing Officers. There's national research and national trainings that we can and should take. So they are giving us a really good foundation for the topic and are sort of spoon feeding us some specific to property valuation and assessment articles, which was really helpful in walking us through that. So yeah, it has to be kind of a combination. We certainly, the last thing we wanted to do is be like, okay, Jill, you're going to now train the state on it. We don't have the staff to do that. We don't want to do it in a bubble. So I think it's a good blend of having that on this. Yeah.
Thank you. Representative Brand.
Thank you.
Representative.
Your question was very similar to mine, and so thank you for asking that. And the answer was helpful, and because I have heard complaints about Swanton, which is the home of the Abnaki, and so that's problematic. So we do have them here in Vermont. So I'll be anxious to see how that fleshes out.
Representative Flynn?
I just wanted to test a bit of intuition. My understanding from what I've experienced of the training that legislators were exposed to is, for instance, the use of computer programs in the assessment field. If that's robust and not tampered with, the program doesn't know the race, for instance, of the owner of the property. So logically, it seems if that bias enters, it must enter somehow when a human being intervenes in the output of the program. So that happens, presumably errors and omissions, appeals, that's where the intervention seems to me to occur. Data entry, and unless somebody's purposely entering data differently, knowing the race of the property owner, which is, I would be very surprised if that were the case. Is that intuition square with what you folks have learned in your training in terms of where to focus your energies?
Yes, and I do feel like what I've heard from the Office of Racial Equity is that there are some like very systemic things that we have baked into even things like computer programs.
In the program.
So we at least have to scrutinize it with that lens. But yes, I would hope that the more subjectivity we can remove from the process.
I'm surprised to hear that.
But I'm not an expert, so.
Yeah.
There's a really amazing film, if anyone on the committee would like to watch it. It's nothing specifically to do with property reappraisal, but it's essentially about implicit bias in computer programming and in computer programs. It's called Coded Bias. It's available for free on the interwebs, and it's a documentary film. I don't think it's a full 2 hours. It's really, I watched it for the first time when my kid was watching it in, I think, middle school. It's really very accessible and very interesting.
Slightly
And it
terrifying.
seems, Representative Sims has also seen that very good film, yeah.
Thanks.
Does any part of this work are you reviewing the grand list and the fields in the grand lists and, okay.
Yeah, that's a big piece. We've started to collect what I think one of the asks from the bill was that we collect all the different data fields that all the different HAMA vendors have. So that's the assessment vendors in each town. So we can get like, okay, what's all the possible data that we have available to us? And then the grand list categories have not really changed much in maybe a couple decades. There's definitely an appetite in the towns and in our team to change the grand list categories to be more useful and helpful to you folks, to be, like, we have both a miscellaneous and an other, right? For just as one example. So a town might use miscellaneous for land. There's also a land category, there's a farm. So it's ripe for review. And that would be one of the recommendations that would come back in December 2024 is like, we haven't had the time to like reach consensus with stakeholders about what that would be that we would recommend, but that is what we need to come back to you folks with in December.
And one more question, just because of my work this summer, are you reviewing how mobile homes are assessed and process of doing that?
Yeah, I mean, that isn't explicitly what we're coming back with in December, but that's a regular conversation with our district advisors in the towns about how we do that and how we treat them in the equalization study as well, right? A lot of properties continue to increase in value just over time, and mobile homes is the opposite, right? They devalue over time. There's also some really interesting shared land lease agreements with mobile homes. But I think you're better versed than I am about, I know you're on that committee. But yeah, I think that's something that I think we need to continue to talk to towns about best practices on how to do that.
And this topic has there's a big component of our contractors research across jurisdictions that'll focus on this too, like which we'll get to in a couple slides, just what's going on in other jurisdictions in terms of having anti-bias and equity considerations built into their valuation practices, and then also, you know, what sort of measurements are going on in other communities to look at vertical equity, you know, how valuation changes happen and how valuation changes are happening in higher priced homes versus lower priced homes in different communities and neighborhoods. And, you know, some findings are that, you know, being like completely objective and, you know, like blind to community factors helps equity. And then there's some level of that which also starts harming equity because of, you know, how much is just baked into the reality of neighborhoods and value already. So really interesting, ripe area to learn a lot more about there. All right, which kind of so brings us to our 2024 plan. So I think we're going to kind of tag team this one.
Yeah, I might go a little out of order
that's great.
before I forget my point. We have actually already done a good deal of stakeholder engagement this past year. It's kind of par for the course because of how Vermont is structured, that our team is literally assigned to groups of towns, and we are regularly engaging with individual towns and VALA and VLCT. We also held a couple of discussions with reappraisal firms and sent out a survey to the CAMA vendors as well to ask for answers to some of those questions and to collect that data. And it was really helpful to start that already, because some of the things that bubbled up were not things that we necessarily had formulated in May or June when this passed. So for example, a lot of the concern is about the number of parcels and who's available to do that workload. And the firm said, well, you can do all these things, but the grievance window is very short. So if I'm covering 20 towns, I can do that over the course of, a year or so, but the grievance window is still really tight. So it might actually be that we want to look at the grievance window and expand that some. So those are kind of things that have already started to bubble up. But we very much will plan on leaning on our contractor, and then of course here in Vermont doing a good deal of outreach. I've already, I was just talking to the Vermont Listers and Assessors Association earlier this week. We speak at their monthly meeting about how they would like that engagement to happen. We really want to reach as many municipalities and as many stakeholders as possible, and sometimes those are sort of self-selecting groups, like the folks who are able to come to a VALA meeting. It might be the same 20 folks, but there's hundreds of people who we may never hear from. So how are the different ways we can reach out to them to really hear back? And for better or worse, one of the big challenges in this work is there is not probably one solution that's going to work for every single town. Like
That would be the challenge with all of
everything.
all of everything, yes. And helping people understand that that's true, because I think we all get attached for one solution.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So that's really important too, right? Is how can we make sure that we make some really great improvements that serves the towns that need them the most and helps the statewide education property tax structure. And that might look different depending on the size of the town and what they need and what reappraisal looks like. So yeah, you'll in a minute you'll go in a little bit more about the contractor research piece, right? So we've already talked about this a bit, the transition planning, right? At some point, we've sort of got to put our stake in the ground and be like, okay, as of this date at this time, this is when this 6-year cycle goes into effect. Because we really didn't want to hamper any reappraisals that are already happening or underway. So that's why I think the sort of by-year is a pretty elegant solution to like that transition, because we definitely don't want to have towns having to reappraise in a 3-year window because they happened to be on time. And then there is a lot more work to do this year on the data analysis. I know there are some particular pieces in the report about use of property, categorization of property, ownership of property, and then related taxation of those properties. There's also a lot more technology available in valuation that we are not leveraging right now because we are doing this in 251 entities rather than as a state. There is a statewide parcel project that is hosted by Vermont Center for Geographic Information, but right now it's voluntary and not all towns participate. And some of the vendors are better than others about updating the maps. So again, it's like, oh, we're so close to having some really good data, but until everyone's on board, there are a lot of things that Vermont as a state we could do that, whether it's orthophotography, shared IT, there's lots of pieces we could do statewide that would be then utilized by each town. That could be a good way to use, a more efficient way to use funds and provide much better data than we might have had 20, 30 years ago when some of these statutes were written. As Rebecca mentioned, we have already started to incorporate the implicit bias training internally and in our documentation, and we have hosted some free webinars that are available nationally, and we are meeting soon to lay out our training schedule for the 2024 season now that we're done with the study. So that will become much more formalized and incorporated also into our certification programs. And then also there's a lot of sort of interest in the field, again, getting back to the things we heard from stakeholders so far, about how to be creative and how to further professionalize and recruit folks to do this work. How can we find people that can be shared across towns to conduct even the regular grand list maintenance? Do we want to leverage, the career centers or the state college system, or other like sort of internship opportunities to get more people into the field? Because it's not a field that you like graduate with a degree in, or that there's a clear path. I don't know if you have high school guidance counselors probably don't know about this. It kind of happens, at least in Vermont.
I have a friend who just went into it after like multiple other things, and it's like incredibly thrilled.
Good.
her new career path, but like she really just like, it was quite an accidental journey.
Yeah, there are a
I'd love
lot
to
of.
talk to her.
There are a lot of, in Vermont, it's generational. There are multiple
Yeah.
folks that learned it from their parents or their grandparents. It's pretty neat, actually.
Yeah, really.
There's a few. But again, so there's the challenge about reappraisal and the reappraisal firms, but then also between each of those and in company with the reappraisal firms, you need listers and assessors to actually be doing the day-to-day grand list maintenance, valuing different properties, maintaining, reviewing permits and making changes, current use allocations, all those things require folks on hand. And there are right now really not enough people to do this. There's a lot of folks who are really sticking in this out of the goodness of their heart because they know their town won't be able to find anybody once they decide they're done. So we do want to also be creative and work with the field about, and there's some good examples of this. Vala actually hosted at their conference this fall, some individuals who were like, basically did like sort of an internship, apprenticeship that's now covering 5 towns in the Loyal County. They're sort of, those towns are sharing that individual. So there are ways to do that. And hopefully, again, back to that map, that might be another way for those towns to be like, hey, we're already reappraising on the same cycle. We're using the same camera system. It's not a full-time job to do the work of listing in this particular town, but then it becomes a little more desirable. Then you might actually, make a decent living. You could maybe have health insurance. You could have a, steady employment, because a lot of these are sort of part-time. So that's another piece that I think that you'll probably hear more from listers and assessors about too, is just how to get more people into this field and trained up. Sorry, that was long.
Oh, great. So I just wanted to go into a little bit more detail.
I have a question about, I thought something was happening on the next slide. My question now. Can you tell me more about sort of the contract with the contractor and the stakeholder engagement?
Yes, that is this slide.
Oh, it is?
Yes.
So sorry.
Research on comparable jurisdictions done by a contractor.
Okay, great.
So we can't go into, until we have a signed contract, we can't talk about like the details about where we're at in that process. But, so I'll just be speaking to the statement of work that we put out in the RFP bid, which is, it's in the appendices of the progress report itself. I was really, pleased with that document, because I feel like it was, just exciting. It's almost like if we all had more hours in the day and more days in 2024, like all the research we'd be eager to do. It's just so very helpful to have, expert contractor to help with this. So the asks are large and plentiful, and we can start at the bottom if you want, Representative Kornheiser, with the Vermont Field Research Strategy.
I'm sorry.
Sure, okay. Well, now I'm curious to start there too, or eager to start there too. So much more detail in the statement of work attached to the report itself, but we've asked this contractor to help devise a primary research, field research strategy in Vermont that would, to learn about our current reappraisal industry, engaging with both state staff and employees, municipal staff, municipal officials, and also folks in the reappraisal industry overall. So interested to have that to supplement our own stakeholder work. I think like the value of having both, PBR, who has a lot of like incredible existing relationships in these worlds, and also an outside contractor doing this, is that we get kind of into our own echo chamber where we're, rely heavily on the relationships we have, which is great. And I think that their reach will be more, broad and universal, and we'll just get to engage more folks that way and kind of, balance the two. So it's a piece that we're really looking forward to, working with a contractor on for sure. And the scope of the rest of the research is broad. So the big question for them, this is going to be research looking at comparable jurisdictions, which may be states, but because of Vermont's size, might likely be big counties or small counties in other states too.
Tiny counties.
Tiny counties in other state too. So in the realm of reappraisals, which is obviously a big focus of this report, we're planning to come back in December with a series of options to improve the reappraisal system that, will absolutely include an option, exploring an option of transitioning some of that work to the state, but also include, reforms that would maintain, municipalities' current roles, but look at other reforms for opportunities to add efficiency, economies of scale, fairness, data improvements, things like that. So to support that work, the contractor is going to be looking at different jurisdictions. What are their cycle lengths? What's the basis of reappraisal in those jurisdictions? What kind of criteria or mechanisms do they have for off-cycle reappraisals? Are they using statistical reappraisals? When and what circumstances? How are reappraisal firms used in other jurisdictions? Are they, more local? Are they more national? Are they, in-house and not private firms? And then just generally, gathering best practices that could be relevant for Vermont. They'll also look specifically at appeal structures in other jurisdictions. What does successful appeals management look like in other places? Like what's the model? What's the volume that a different political subdivision is taking in terms of appeals, and if any evaluation of those outcomes in terms of like fairness and equity. Property data is going to be a big topic for them too. Like how are property types categorized in other states or jurisdictions' tax rolls? I learned that grand list isn't like a universal term of art. Yeah. Yeah. So I use tax rolls. Yeah. Fun. So like how is data collected in other jurisdictions, and what kind of technology is being leveraged in other places? How is data aggregated at which political subdivision level? And then getting into some of the weeds that we were asked to look at here, how are other jurisdictions defining residential units and other key data points that are important for policy making, kind of looking for best practices there too. These guys will also look into reappraisal industry capacity and capacity building in those other jurisdictions, looking at the size of the industry in comparable jurisdictions relative to the number of parcels, seeing what's kind of hot in training and career advancement in other places, try to find some examples of success in other spots, and then definitely looking at equity and anti-bias measures in other jurisdictions too. Are there equity-focused measures in place in their valuation system? Are they evaluating that vertical equity in terms of like the change in value of a lower priced property versus a higher priced property? And what are opportunities for best practices in tax administration that we're finding in other areas where folks are on the cutting edge of this stuff?
Good question. You have a measure for that vertical equity. What's that called? I mean, it's being used now.
Yeah, Jake talks about that. Well, are you thinking about the coefficient of dispersion or COD?
No, it's
yeah, there is a statistical tool that we have right now that Jake is much more fluid on than I am. But it also seems like opportunity to look deeper than what we have now as well.
That's being used to some extent.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I just this morning, I think I got the updated link from the Lincoln Land Institute. They have a vertical equity app that's open source that any jurisdiction can use to just apply. I haven't actually played with it much, but
That's an amazing organization.
Yeah.
In terms of like their work on all of this.
Agreed.
and sort of related, I don't want to go off too much of a tangent, but part of that same like sort of equity discussion is, this is happening in parallel with, we have our commercial and utility valuation work happening sort of in total parallel, totally separate from reappraisal. But again, it gets back to, there is a lot of focus on like residential valuation and the specifics of that and the minutia of that and the subjectivity of that. But we are also, sort of with our other hand, looking at that equity on much more high value properties in Vermont too.
Totally. And part of the engagement with the eventual contractor won't just be, like delivering, this big chunk of research near the end of the year for us to, like work up into our report, but also monthly check-ins, which we're really excited to use to, kind of like trade ideas about like, where we're at in our internal, like thinking and stakeholder engagement, what they're hearing, like be able to bounce back information and data and ideas regularly with the folks doing the research. So.
One request I would have that I think we didn't put into the statute is often when we hire contractors with a lot of expertise outside the state of Vermont, which is incredible because we get to learn about how the rest of the world does things, they don't have the time or take the time to understand the nature of the fact that we have a statewide grand list essentially and the education fund implications for that. And so just want to make sure that you're drilling that in early and often.
Yeah, no,
Then I'll read the report and I'll be like,
This is cool. That's not really useful though, because they missed this like glaring huge piece of data.
right, and that's actually, it was an important consideration for us in deciding whether or not to involve the contractor in like the Vermont field research space. We had like weighed, I think we've all had that experience of being like, oh, great, national expert who like, clearly almost understood our system here, but I think it's like the balance of having, our own stakeholder engagement and their work will be really important there.
And the fresh eyes might wind up a totally different answer
Exactly.
than you would as someone who's already, you are stakeholders too, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. And we thought the benefits would outweigh the challenges there. And it would be kind of like a cool opportunity for them to engage in how things work on the ground, in a different way than our experts in the tax department can even provide. But yeah, as Jill said, we got two really smart people that aren't up here today. Well, make sure our contractors know what's up. Yeah, so that's our last slide for today, and happy to keep taking questions now or as you guys digest the report.
And the main body of the report is only 6 pages and it's pretty large font. So if you do want to, it looks thick because there's multiple tables, but
And good appendices.
you can
Really cool.
skim the first 5 pages.
I am both embarrassed and excited that you bothered. Any other questions from you?
Thanks, this was really great. I'm just wondering what opportunities we're gonna have as the process unfolds to catch up with you again on progress, and I think this is, I'm really heartened to hear everything you've said, and so just that question. I've got a second question too.
I mean, I think we'll come back whenever asked, and I would think by later in the session, we'd certainly have our contractor in place, I would hope, and we'd have done some stakeholder outreach by then. I mean, we could give sort of an update, a progress update.
Good.
Yeah, we don't want to make too much work for you, but the sort of community level stakeholder engagement is such a really important part of this process. And so we want to make sure that we're staying in communication about that.
And this is slightly off topic, but close. Anything you want to share from the equalization study?
Next Friday.
Okay, great, okay.
We're not, actually, we are jammed vigilant about it, so.
Good to know.
Yes.
I mean, again, there are pieces of this work that will have positive impacts on those outcomes, right? So the equalization study is a measure, it's a sort of a reflection back. It's not that it's the boogeyman in and of itself, but it again shows, especially for really small towns that can't find folks to reappraise, they continue to sort of suffer the consequences of that. And also the smaller number of sales you have, the more volatile each sale is in those calculations. So, but yeah, I think I'm coming back to talk through the PVR annual report next week. Sort of patiently trying to work with me to find a time I can actually be here. But we can definitely have, I think in the past, Jake Feldman and I have come in and talked through the study specifically. We're happy to do that too.
Do people, so for a long time, PVR published books on this. They are not doing that anymore. But if anyone feels really heartbroken about that, we can certainly do that in our own print shop in advance. Would anyone like that?
I am getting some printed.
Oh.
So that if some.
She said it on the record. We just get one for our committee room? To just like be a reference.
Certainly. Yeah, I think we went too far the other way last year where we didn't print any. And
Yeah, I'm sure you had requests.
It is one of those things, it's nice to have the table. So we're making sure when we and it should be out early next week because it's getting polished up right now. So it will have the main report with all the different sort of narratives and sort of summary of the latest information. And then there will be the data pages, which will be available both as Excel spreadsheets and as printable PDFs. So if folks, if I don't bring a printed copy and you end up wanting to print it off, it will be very easy to do that off our site, rather than trying to print an Excel document.
Great, thank you. Yeah, Representative.
Yeah, when we passed the bill last year, I had a couple of listers in Norwich in particular, were very concerned to know what we're doing to them. Your slides, your presentation, I think is all the answers I need to give them and say, look, geez, you know, this is gonna be very helpful. So, thank you.
Thank you.
I have a vague memory of a hand over here, but that didn't happen. Okay, great. Thank you both so much for all of your work on this. I know that we all want to really improve the system, and I know that you all have more than enough work to do before we took on this project. So I thank you for all of your grace through that. Yeah.
And anytime, I would be remiss if I didn't say, anytime you folks want to talk more about these pieces, I would recommend hearing from Vala and VLCT, the folks doing that work.
I thought they would actually be here today, so
I bet they're listening.
Watching us on YouTube, and I say hello.
Thank you.
Awesome.
We're gonna take a brief